The cry was faint, almost swallowed by the shimmer of heat that rose from the earth. At first it seemed like nothing more than the whistle of dry wind, but then it came again, thin, uneven, the kind of sound that carried helplessness at its core. The rangers slowed, scanning the ochre dust until they saw a small shape pressed low against the ground. A calf, no more than a few months old, his ribs rising like fragile arches with each shallow breath. His ears flickered weakly, trembling at the edge of silence, and his trunk stretched across the dirt as if reaching for something that was not there. The herd was gone. Only faint, wind-scuffed tracks cut the ground around him, already fading into emptiness. The men did not move quickly. Instinct urged them forward, but experience made them hold back. Approaching too soon might drive the calf deeper into panic or drain what little energy remained. Instead, they watched, the heat pressing heavy on their shoulders, the air filled with cicadas and the long hush of grass. One of them whispered, not to anyone in particular, "He's been here a while." The calf stirred at the sound, lifting his head just enough for his eyes to catch the light. They were wide, glassy, fixed on movement but not yet trust. Minutes stretched. The calf shifted his weight, pressing forelegs into the earth, trying to rise. His body wavered, shoulders sagging. With a soft, exhausted rumble, he collapsed again, trunk curling back toward his chest. A thin film of dust clung to his skin, catching in the creases of his legs. He looked small against the vastness of the open land, smaller still for the silence around him, as though the world had stepped back and left him to its edge. The rangers took in the scene carefully, the angle of his breathing, the streaks of dryness at the corners of his mouth, the restless flick of his tail, even in weakness. Everything suggested he had been separated for longer than a few hours. The tracks around him told a story of movement, hurried and uncertain, perhaps a herd startled into retreat, leaving the calf unnoticed in the panic. There were no signs of struggle, only absence. Slowly, one man unfastened the canteen from his belt. He knelt, pressing his hand into the earth to show weight but not intention. The calf lifted his trunk, nostrils twitching, scenting the air. There was no lunge, no wild resistance, only a wavering pause, as though fear and need weighed equally on him. The ranger poured a small stream of water into the dust, letting the scent carry first, then shifted the trickle toward the calf's trunk. The little one flinched, then leaned closer, curling his trunk awkwardly toward the moisture. A drop touched his lips. Another followed. His ears eased just slightly, in a sign as subtle as it was profound. "It's all right," the ranger murmured, voice barely above the insect's hum. The calf stilled at the sound, then drank again, slow and tentative. The others stood a step behind, forming a loose circle without walls, leaving every path open should the calf choose to flee. Patience filled the silence more strongly than words ever could. The sun bent higher, heat building, yet the calf began to shift his position, gathering his legs beneath him once more. With a trembling effort he pushed up, stumbling forward a step before sinking again. His body quivered from the strain, but there was something new, an attempt, not surrender. His small call, raw and searching, lifted again into the day. For the rangers, concern deepened but also steadied. This calf was not ready to walk far, yet his will still lingered. They knew that each decision from this point had to be quiet and measured. Too much force, too sudden a gesture, and trust would vanish. Too little support, and the calf might not last until nightfall. They stood with that balance pressing against them, dust stirring faintly around their boots, while in the center of it all, the cry of a single abandoned life asked what would happen next. The stillness that followed was not empty. It was filled with choice, the beginning of a rescue, written not in speed, but in the softness of waiting. The heat pressed heavily over the land, but the rangers had learned that comfort could be built from small gestures. They carried no shade with them, only what the trees and their own patience could provide. One man stepped quietly to a thorn tree a short distance away, cutting loose a branch heavy with leaves. He laid it into the dust near the calf, its green shadow softening the glare that burned from above. The calf shifted his gaze, weary eyes following, but he did not pull away. His body trembled with each rise and fall of his chest, yet beneath that tremor was a rhythm that had steadied since the first sips of water. They worked slowly, as though each motion might ripple into the calf's fragile trust. The water was offered again, not directly forced, but set into a shallow fold of earth so the scent reached him first. His trunk stretched toward it hesitantly, curling and uncurling with unpracticed movements. Drops slipped down his lips, catching in the fine hairs around his mouth. A low rumble followed, so soft it might have been mistaken for the distant roll of thunder, yet the Rangers recognized it for what it was, a sound of need, tinged with a fragile calm. The circle they formed around him was not of walls, but of space. Each Ranger kept to the edges, hands loose at their sides, speaking only in brief murmurs to one another. Their eyes moved constantly, not only on the calf but on the horizon, searching for any flicker of dust or shadow that might belong to a returning herd. One of them bent low to the ground, tracing a line in the sand where the tracks had begun to blur. "They passed through quickly," he whispered. The others nodded, understanding the unspoken truth. There was no certainty they would return. The calf pushed once more at the earth, beneath him, straining to rise. This time his legs held a little longer. He stood, unsteady, knees quivering, head swaying as though the weight of his own body surprised him. His ears fanned outward, catching faint currents of air. He took a step, then another before pausing, trunk curling toward the Rangers. His eyes, dark and wide, seemed to measure the distance not in fear, but in a quiet search for reassurance. One Ranger lowered himself onto his heels, voice hushed. "Easy, little one," he said, nothing more. The calf's head tilted, ears flicking once before he leaned down again toward the small patch of shade. He folded his legs beneath him with care, resting this time not in collapse, but in choice. Around them the landscape carried on with its indifference. Insects droned, grasses shivered under the dry wind, and the air pulsed with heat. Yet within the circle of men and calf, a different rhythm was taking root. Slower, calmer, anchored not by urgency but by patience. The Rangers exchanged glances, speaking less now, allowing silence to carry the weight of the moment. Each shift of the calf's trunk, each ripple of his skin under the breath of wind, was observed with quiet attention. They could see how exhaustion still claimed him, but they also saw the signs of life that had returned. The way his ears no longer drooped entirely, the faint gleam of moisture at the corner of his mouth, the steadier rise of his chest. He was not yet safe, but he was no longer alone. One Ranger traced the spoor leading out of the clearing, following it with careful steps. The marks bent toward the open plains, shallow and hurried, as though the herd had moved with sudden fear. He crouched and studied the ground, the silence of his work mirrored by the calf who watched with still eyes. The Ranger returned without words, only a small shake of the head, but the others understood. For now there was only waiting, and in that waiting, trust had to be built grain by grain. As the sun shifted westward, the circle remained. The calf, lulled by shade and water, stretched his trunk once more toward the Rangers, brushing the ground near their boots. His rumble was faint, uncertain, but it carried. The men did not move to close the gap. They allowed him the choice, allowed him the space to decide whether these figures meant safety or something else. The answer, for now, was a quiet acceptance. The afternoon had settled into a heavy stillness when the faint sound reached them. It was low, almost swallowed by the shifting air, but distinct enough to hold them motionless. An elephant rumble carried from somewhere beyond the thorn and grass. The Rangers listened, trading quiet glances, then turned their eyes toward the spoor etched faintly in the earth. The calf, resting in the shade, lifted his head at the same moment, ears twitching, trunk lifting uncertainly into the breeze. His body quivered with the effort, but something within him had stirred. The men rose carefully, their movements deliberate, never rushed. They stepped to the tracks, reading them like lines of an unfinished story. The prints curved eastward, shallow impressions scattered by time and wind. They spoke of a herd moving quickly, perhaps frightened, but still together. One Ranger crouched, pressing his palm into the dust beside a print half filled with grit. It was not fresh, but neither was it old. Hope, though fragile, carried its own weight in silence. They coaxed the calf gently to his feet. He swayed, testing his legs before leaning into the rhythm of his own small steps. Each movement was unsteady, yet determined, his trunk sweeping low as though searching for invisible threads that might lead him home. The Rangers walked with him, but never close enough to trap his choice. They formed a line of quiet guardians, giving space, their voices absent except for the occasional murmur of reassurance. "Steady now," one whispered as the calf stumbled, then caught himself again. The land stretched wide, dotted with termite mounds and patches of brittle grass that brushed against the calf's legs. A faint dust plume shifted on the horizon, too far to promise but near enough to draw them forward. Every so often, the distant call came again, carried by air that smelled faintly of water and dung. Each time it reached them, the calf paused, lifting his trunk high, nostrils flaring. His ears fanned wide, and a small rumble answered from deep within his chest, tentative but insistent. For a while, it seemed the earth itself was guiding them. The prints grew clearer, the ground holding the rounded marks of heavy feet pressed in soft succession. The calf quickened as much as his weakness allowed, tugged forward by instinct and sound. Yet, when at last the shapes of elephants appeared in the distance, the moment shifted. The herd stood clustered near the edge of a grove, their bodies half in shadow, half in light. They were still, heads raised, trunks lifted to test the shifting air. Their stance was not welcoming, but cautious, as though the small figure approaching did not belong. The calf halted. His trunk curled back, his ears pressed close to his head. A faint, broken cry escaped him, carrying across the space, but the herd did not rush forward. They held their ground, murmurs rolling low among them, a language of uncertainty. The rangers stopped too, careful not to break the fragile moment. Their breaths were quiet, their bodies loose, waiting. They knew they could not bridge the space with force, could not decide the outcome. All they could do was remain steady at the calf's side, a presence that had so far carried him across the dust. The calf turned slightly, his steps faltering backward until his body brushed near the men again. His sides heaved and his eyes lingered on them with a weight of hesitation, as if the distance before him had grown too wide. He gave a low rumble, not of trust alone, but of need. Seeking what? Was familiar in the rhythm of their stillness. The herd shifted, a ripple of bodies, their trunks sweeping the ground, their calls mixing in unease. One female stepped forward half a length, then stilled again. Dust swirled between them all, carrying both promise and doubt. For a moment, it seemed as though reunion would not come. The air itself felt held, stretched between two fragile bonds, the calf's faint trust in the humans who had guided him here, and the herd's uncertainty over whether he belonged to them or to the past. The rangers did not speak. They only stood, open, respectful, the line between intervention and surrender balanced on silence. The calf leaned once more into their steadiness, pressing the ground with quivering legs. The future waited, caught in the pause of the herd's breath and the slow exhale of men who understood that sometimes rescue was not in holding on, but in knowing when to step back. The standstill stretched, the calf caught between the human presence behind him and the wall of silence from the herd ahead. His ears pressed close to his head, trunk lifting and falling without direction, a sound caught in his throat that carried more question than call. Then, from the edge of the group, one female moved. She was large, her hide marked with the pale dust of many journeys, and her steps were slow, deliberate, as though weighed by something deeper than caution. The others shifted as she passed, their bodies forming a loose crescent, leaving space for her to decide what the moment would become. The calf gave another faint cry, thinner this time, his legs trembling with fatigue. The female paused, her head tilting, trunk suspended as she pulled the air in steady breaths. The low rumble that followed seemed to roll through the ground itself, a vibration that stilled the calf mid-step. It was not a call of alarm, nor of dominance. It carried something quieter, almost searching. She came closer, her trunk sweeping the air around him in careful arcs. The calf stood uncertain, caught between fear and need, yet his trunk lifted clumsily to meet hers. When her breath touched his skin, he did not retreat. She lingered there, scenting him, tracing the line of his back and the dust clinging to his small body. The rangers watching did not move, their eyes fixed on the delicate exchange unfolding at the edge of the grove. This female had known the ache of loss. Only days before, her own newborn had not risen to its feet, the herd's mourning carried out in heavy silence before they were forced to leave the still form behind. The memory lingered in her, shaping the depth of her call now, and in that shared space between grief and instinct, she found this calf and did not turn away. The calf leaned forward, a tentative step, his trunk curling again toward her. A broken rumble slipped from his chest, higher pitched, unsteady. She answered with another, lower and more grounded, a sound that seemed to wrap around him, like the embrace he had been searching for. She stepped closer, so near that her shadow fell over him. When he wavered, too weak to hold himself upright, she reached with her trunk and steadied him against her leg. The herd shifted again, their semicircle widening, trunks lifting as if to breathe in the decision being made. The unease that had lingered a moment before softened, carried away like dust in a sudden breeze. Acceptance, subtle and unspoken, moved through them. Their low rumbles merged into a sound that was neither mournful nor questioning, but something steadier, something that welcomed. The Rangers exhaled as one, though none of them had realized they had been holding their breath. One of them whispered under it, "She's taking him." The words were not triumphant, only reverent. They knew this was not their doing. It was the herd's choice, the mother's choice, born from instincts older than their own presence on this land. The calf, still pressed against her leg, shifted his weight and attempted to nuzzle beneath her. He was unsteady, his body too thin, yet he moved with certainty now. She adjusted her stance, allowing him to rest in the space beneath her belly, and lowered her trunk to sweep gently across his back once more. The sound she gave was longer this time, a steadying rumble that answered his plea not with pity, but with belonging. The Rangers remained at their distance, silent witnesses. They had brought him this far, but it was no longer theirs to continue. The miracle lay not in human intervention, but in the way grief could turn to care, in the way the herd had bent to make space for one more life. As the sun dipped lower, the calf stayed within the protection of her body, moving only when she moved. The herd shifted, preparing to turn back toward the plains, their steps slow and sure. Dust rose again, curling into the cooling air. The calf stumbled once but did not fall, his steps caught by the rhythm of the female who guided him forward. Acceptance had come like rain after drought, sudden, quiet, and deeply needed. In that moment, the calf was no longer abandoned. He had found not just shelter, but a second chance carved from another's loss. The calf remained pressed close beneath the shelter of the female's body, his trunk brushing against her skin as he tried again and again to fit into the rhythm of her steps. At first, his movements were clumsy, his legs folding too quickly beneath him, but she adjusted her stride with quiet patience. Each time he faltered, her trunk reached back, sweeping gently over his back as though reminding him that he was no longer alone. The herd's murmur rose and fell around them, a chorus of low rumbles and steady breaths that folded the calf into their living circle. When they paused in the dimming light, the female leaned her body to one side, guiding the calf toward her belly. He hesitated, trunk curling uncertainly at first, then pressed his mouth against her, seeking the nourishment he had been denied for so long. For a moment, silence stretched as the herd stilled. Then the calf latched, his body trembling with relief, each swallow small but determined. A new steadiness seemed to spread through him, his ears flicking with more life than they had held all day. The Rangers, standing at a respectful distance, watched without a word. The sound of that quiet nursing carried more weight than anything they could say. The light began to soften, spilling across the land in long, amber strokes. The herd shifted together, forming a line that pointed toward water they knew was waiting beyond the trees. The calf, renewed by the first strength of milk, moved between the towering legs of his new protectors. He was hidden in their shadows, glimpsed only in the spaces between, yet his small form seemed already a part of their movement. Each step he took matched a larger one beside him, his body swaying into their rhythm with growing confidence. The Rangers did not follow. They knew this path was no longer theirs to walk. One of them exhaled slowly, lowering his voice to barely more than breath. "Safe now," he murmured, though the calf could not hear. His companions nodded in silence, their eyes fixed on the shifting line of elephants as they carried the little one further from human care and deeper into the wild that had nearly abandoned him. The air cooled as evening drew in. The grasses swayed in the gentler wind, carrying the scent of earth and water. The calf gave a small, uneven call, higher pitched than the rest, and it was answered at once by the female who had claimed him. Her rumble was steady, grounding, and the sound seemed to settle him between the legs and shadows where he now belonged. The Rangers lingered, their boots pressing shallow prints into the dust. They would remain visible for only a short while, swept away by wind or the tread of animals, but in their fading marks was a story that would not be lost. They had not carried him home themselves, nor forced a reunion. Instead, they had been present in the fragile space between despair and possibility, offering only patience, only presence until the wild itself decided. The herd's shapes grew smaller as they moved across the plain, silhouettes bending with the land, a drifting rhythm against the deepening sky. The calf remained close to the female, his ears now lifted, his trunk brushing her side as though to confirm her presence with each step. The last light of day caught them in a glow that felt almost like benediction. The rangers turned at last, leaving the plain behind them. The echo of low rumbles carried faintly on the wind, and with it, the quiet gratitude of men who knew they had witnessed something rare. Not rescue in the human sense, but survival chosen and offered by the herd itself. The day ended without ceremony. The sun slipped low, painting the horizon with pale fire, and the grasses bowed under the soft weight of the breeze. In the fading light, the small form of the calf disappeared into the rhythm of the herd, and the wild closed gently around him once more. Under the lengthening shadows of the plain, the herd slowed their movement. Dust drifted low, curling softly around their legs as the evening wind carried the smell of water ahead. The calf pressed close to the female's side, still weak, yet no longer stumbling as he had before. Each step seemed steadier, more certain, guided not by strength alone but by the comfort of her presence. The rangers could see how he leaned against her flank at times, how his small trunk brushed her skin as if testing again and again that she remained there. Every gesture spoke of need, and every patient response from the female turned that need into belonging. When the herd finally paused, they gathered loosely in a circle, facing outward as if forming a wall of watchfulness. The female stayed near the center, standing broad and protective over the calf. He shifted beneath her, his tail flicking lightly, ears twitching in the cooler breeze. His trunk lifted once, curling toward the rangers in the distance, but his attention soon turned back to the body above him. He gave a faint rumble, hesitant, almost questioning, and it was answered at once by the low, steady call of the female. That exchange seemed to anchor him, pulling him deeper into the living fabric of the herd. The rangers remained still, their silence shaped by awe rather than hesitation. They knew how rare it was for such a moment to unfold. A calf, orphaned or abandoned, rarely found acceptance, and rarer still did another mother open space for him so willingly. One ranger rubbed the back of his wrist across his brow, eyes never leaving the pair. He whispered, more to himself than to anyone else, "She's giving him a chance." The others nodded, saying nothing. Words seemed too heavy against the lightness of what they had been allowed to witness. As twilight deepened, the herd began to move again, their bodies stretching into a line that threaded toward the horizon. The calf was no longer at the edge of things. He walked now in the current of their movement, shielded by their size, his steps aligning with theirs. The faint sound of his small rumble carried back on the wind, blending with the deeper calls around him until it was impossible to separate his voice from theirs. The rangers lingered a moment longer, until the last shapes of the herd melted into distance. When they finally turned away, the plain was quiet once more, save for the sigh of grass and the fading glow of the sun. Yet in that quiet, the memory of what had unfolded remained sharp, a reminder that even in the harshest corners of the wild, loss could bend into renewal. The prince of the calf and his newfound family trailed forward into the dusk, disappearing into the wide embrace of the land. Behind them, only the rangers' footprints remained, soft impressions that the wind would soon erase, but what they carried within them would not fade.